Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, Labour conference has many fringe events covering multiple topics, but one this evening was supposed to have the Venezuelan ambassador as a key speaker. Now, left-wingers in the Labour Party, such as Jeremy Corbyn himself, have long held Venezuela up as a model of socialist government. But with its economy tanking and its government being accused of human rights abuses, would the Labour left's attitude change? Earlier, I spoke to Jeremy Corbyn about that, plus accusations that his party has itself become nasty and intolerant. But first, Michael Crick is at that fringe event.
Well, John, yes, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recently accused the Venezuela regime under Nicolas Maduro of crimes against humanity. The ill treatment of detainees, he said, including, in some cases, torture and death threats. Well, well over 100 people came here tonight to express their solidarity with the Venezuelan people and with the Venezuelan government. They didn't get the ambassador, she pulled out, but what they did hear from was Chris Williamson, a close ally on Labour's front bench, who gave a very fiery speech in which he said the vast majority of violence in Venezuela had been caused by the right-wing opposition. He insisted Venezuela is a democratic state. He accused the media, including this programme, of being unbalanced in our coverage and said the only media outlet that had been fair was the Morning Star. Now, why does any of this matter? Because, as you say, for Jeremy Corbyn and so many of his close allies, in the past, the socialist governments of Venezuela under Chavez and now Maduro have been an inspiration to them. But now, of course, the events of the last few months put them in rather a difficult position. Venezuela's been in turmoil. Around 130 people killed in street protests this year. Opposition politicians arrested by the Maduro government. More than 400 critics prosecuted in military courts, say Human Rights Watch, without due process. And for ordinary Venezuelans, huge shortages of food and medicines.
Development of Venezuela.
But Jeremy Corbyn was long a great champion of the socialist regimes in Venezuela. This is what he said when the previous leader, Hugo Chavez, died 4 years ago.
Inspiration to all of us fighting back against austerity and neoliberal economics in Europe showed us there is a different and a better way of doing things.
Jeremy Corbyn.
And then he congratulated the new president, Maduro, by telephone.
Felicitaciones para ti, señor presidente.
3 years ago, Corbyn's close advisor, Seamus Milne, met and interviewed Maduro for The Guardian, then expressed his solidarity a few weeks later.
Another world is not only possible, but it's being created right now.
Yet today, Mr. Milne was silent.
Will you be going to the Venezuela meeting tonight? You've always been very pro the Venezuelan government. You still feel that way? What do you think of their human rights record? People being tortured, threatened with sexual violence? Is that acceptable? Journalists being arrested? Is that acceptable? And you have nothing to say about it.
I'd love it.
Diane Abbott, too, was once very vocal in backing Venezuela's socialist governments.
According to the UN, are you not willing to condemn that?
Meanwhile, Unite, the union led by Len McCluskey, have been big backers of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, which staged tonight's meeting.
There are issues at stake here, the involvement of all kinds of subversive forces in Venezuela.
Very like Donald Trump.
The CIA involvement, big business,
what about
multinationals.
the abuse of human rights by the Venezuelan government, as shown by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the UN?
Yes, Michael, calm yourself. We oppose any human rights violations.
Are you willing to condemn the Maduro government for their human rights violations?
We have already fed in our concerns about
concerns.
Yes,
concerns about political opponents being arrested, tortured,
Michael,
threatened with sexual violence, electric shock treatment.
Yes, we've condemned all of that.
So you condemn the Maduro.
Well, journalists weren't allowed to ask any questions at tonight's meeting. The Venezuelan ambassador didn't come, but she did send a message saying that her country had been the victim of systematic aggression by the US, including sanctions, and she said threats of military aggression.
Michael Crick at the Labour Party conference in Brighton. Well, earlier in Brighton, I met up with Jeremy Corbyn. I began by asking him whether he had prevented conference from debating any motion that would have set his party's policy on Brexit.
Sorry, John, nonsense. We had a statement, we had a debate, we had votes, we've had a discussion.
The very people who handed the thing out said this is mush, and it is mush, it doesn't say anything.
What it says is that we want to negotiate for a tariff-free trade access to the European Union, we want to protect rights and conditions coming from Europe in workers, consumers and environment, and that's the strategy we're doing. But crucially, we would also legislate immediately to give permanent residence to EU nationals living in this country.
But does that sit with the single market, the customs union and freedom of movement?
We argued for a transition period, and that the government has belatedly come round to sort of agreeing to, because we think that the whole thing has been very badly handled by the government. After all, we're 15 months since the referendum and they've made no progress at all. Therefore, the only sensible thing to do now is have a transition period, which I hope will be agreed between both parties to the negotiations. Remember, we're not a party to the negotiations.
No, but a transitional period is one thing. A commitment beyond the traditional, the transitional period to freedom of movement, to a single market.
Our commitment is to access to the single market, access to the European market, to ensure that we protect manufacturing industry and jobs in this country. That is the basis. There was a referendum, there was a result of that referendum. We have to respect that result.
So you are passionately in favour of freedom of movement?
We are going to have to understand that large numbers of European Union nationals have made an enormous contribution to our economy, as indeed British nationals have across Europe, and that will continue.
But that's a completely different issue. Guaranteeing the rights of the people who live here is one thing, but it's the rights of people to come here that is freedom of movement.
There will be a continuation of a very large amount of movement because of the needs of the economy and of people. That will be subject to negotiation of managed migration.
But we can therefore distill this as your personal commitment to freedom of movement.
No, what you're trying to do is distill something that doesn't yet exist.
Well, the danger is...
No, hang on, the negotiations haven't finished yet, and we are not a party to the negotiations.
There are people already looking at you and wondering if you're the most anti-immigrant Labour leader of all time. Your commitment to freedom of movement has never been openly stated.
My commitment is that we will continue to have movement between Europe and Britain. Obviously, it's necessary for economy, it's necessary for people.
But you won't use the phrase.
It's necessary for families to be able to move, it's necessary for industries to be able to recruit them. The only point I've made consistently through the referendum and since then is that we would oppose and challenge the way in which companies exploit low-paid groups of workers, bring them in to undercut in the construction industry and many other industries, and so we would want a similarity of economic and employment conditions.
Now, in the last election, many people voted Labour precisely because they believed that in voting Labour there was a better chance of getting a better Brexit, if not possibly rolling the thing back altogether. Do you accept that you've disappointed them?
Not at all. We have campaigned consistently for an exit from the European Union that maintains the economic relationship with Europe, that protects jobs on both sides of the Channel and maintains that good relationship with Europe. And we don't turn ourselves into some kind of tax haven. We don't do sweetheart deals with Donald Trump.
So it's not a Norway solution?
The relationship would be, I mean, it's hard to put parallels on it. The relationship would be a positive economic relationship, a positive movement relationship, a positive investment relationship.
But no power to affect it?
Well, of course we'd have powers to
Well, we wouldn't be members of the European Union, and what you're arguing for is effectively...
What you seem to be forgetting is there was a referendum that voted to leave the European Union.
by a very small majority.
There was a majority vote to leave the European Union. Personally, I voted to remain. Personally, I campaigned to remain.
The PFI policy that was sketched out by John MacDonald yesterday really looked at, he actually stated very, very firmly that not only did you want to freeze any new ones, but you also wanted to ensure to actually take back into public ownership those that had already been committed. Your health spokesman, John Ashworth, talked on the radio this morning about the policy. He said, we will look at the hospitals and the rest that have been built under PFI. Which is it?
We want to take the PFIs over and take them back into public ownership because it is, after all, wait a minute, after all, it is a public debt. A PFI debt is a public debt, and the interest rates paid on capital expenditure and the lack of control over the development of hospitals and schools that have been built under PFI is a serious administrative problem, and taking them over and exchanging the PFI for government bonds would actually save us all a great deal of money. It seems to me a very sensible thing to do.
But it will be 50 billion just on the health service alone. Where are you going to get the money from?
Well, you exchange what is already a public debt. There's a public debt of 50 billion, as you say, on the NHS alone through PFI. That's a public debt you and I owe.
So you borrow the 50 billion, or you get someone to give it to you?
You exchange it for government bonds in return for taking the PFI over. The interest rate on government bonds is obviously a lot less than the penurious rate of interest that PFI companies get.
Now, Emily Thornberry made a very personal attack on Boris Johnson. There's also been complaints from several Labour MPs of anti-Semitic statements in fringe meetings. And good heavens, the BBC's political editor, Laura Coonsborough, has to be accompanied by a bodyguard around a Labour Party conference. What has this come to? Is this the nasty party?
That is awful thing for you to say. This is not a nasty party. This is the biggest Labour conference we've had for many, many years. And nobody should be abused, whoever they are. And we've just passed a motion on racism and anti-Semitism, which is comprehensive, is inclusive, as it was supported by all wings of the party, and indeed unanimously agreed by our National Executive.
Well, the MPs, John Cryer and Wes Streeting, have both identified serious breaches of that already. I mean, what are you doing about it beyond passing rules?
Anyone using anti-Semitic language, anyone using any form of racist language is completely at odds with the rules of this party.
But aren't you also incredibly uncomfortable at the idea, not only of that, but much more the idea that the political editor of the BBC, for goodness sake, is having to be accompanied round this conference by a bodyguard?
I don't wish anyone to have to be accompanied by a bodyguard anywhere in our society, and certainly not in our conference.
Final question. You've always been quite voluble on the matter of Venezuela. Now, the disintegration of Venezuela you've blamed on all parties, just as Donald Trump blamed the racial violence in Charlottesville on all parties. Do you now accept what Amnesty International and the United Nations itself is telling you? Most of this violence is authored and carried out by the government of President Maduro.
I've looked at those reports, and obviously I'm appalled at any violence that's carried out and the sources of it. There is, I hope, going to be an effective regional process that will help to bring about conciliation and a democratic solution in Venezuela. I think the economic problems of Venezuela are partly the source of some of this, because there hasn't been enough diversity of investment of the oil revenues.
But you are one of the few European leaders who has real influence in Venezuela. Why don't you tell President Maduro just to stop?
I have made it very clear that there should not be any abuses of human rights, or any violence, or any abuse of free speech, of any abuses of human rights by anybody, including the
Trump answer.
No, wait a minute. No, it's not. You seem to have a very strange view of what Donald Trump does. This is a process that has to be resolved democratically within Venezuela, and the regional powers regional powers have offered to intervene to assist, and clearly any actions that oppress free speech are wrong.
But I notice you don't use the word government and you don't use the word Maduro, and they are to blame.
That includes the government, of course it does.
And President Maduro.
Look, it includes the government, and he's the president
Do
of
you
it.
condemn President Maduro?
Look, Venezuela has been through a process of which it has been subject to a lot of opposition. They've had an economic policy which I think has suffered because of the fall in oil revenues, and there have been, quite rightly reported, abuses of human rights. They have to be deplored. They have been deplored. I do deplore them.
Jeremy Corbyn, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.